Welcome to the Golden Gems podcast. Today, we're taking a deep dive into Joe Rogan and the forensic breakdown of how a stand-up comic built the most powerful, uncensored media platform in modern America.
Yeah, and to truly grasp the scale of the architectural blueprint we're deconstructing today, we have to kind of ground ourselves in the current reality.
Right.
Because today is March 22, 2026. The subject of our deep dive is 58 years old. He's broadcasting out of this, fortified state-of-the-art studio complex in Austin, Texas.
Which is insane to think about.
Totally. He's commanding a staggering 14.5 million listeners per episode, and he's operating fresh off a $250 million non-exclusive renewal with Spotify.
I really want you to hold that figure in your head for a moment. $250 million for a non-exclusive deal.
Yeah, the non-exclusive part is key.
Exactly. I mean, in an era that is completely defined by algorithmic conformity and corporate censorship and, highly sanitized public relations, he has somehow constructed what is arguably the last truly independent cultural sanctuary.
Right, and our mission for this deep dive is to figure out the actual mechanics of how he did it. How does a blue-collar kid from New Jersey become the single most disruptive force in global media?
Well, you don't find the answer by looking at the wealthy, influential broadcaster of 2026. You really have to dig into the genealogical foundations.
Yeah, you have to go all the way back.
Right. The origin story begins on August 11, 1967 in Newark, New Jersey. And Newark in the late 60s was just an incredibly unforgiving industrial environment.
Yeah, but the physical landscape of the city was almost secondary to the volatility inside his own home.
Oh, absolutely.
The baseline reality of his early childhood was defined by severe domestic abuse. The marriage dissolved when he was 5, and by the time he reached age 7, his father permanently ceased contact.
I want to pause on that because a father vanishing at age 7 isn't just some, biographical footnote.
No, not at all.
When you look at the mechanics of early childhood development, that kind of severe domestic trauma, followed by sudden, permanent abandonment, it fundamentally rewires a child's nervous system.
Yeah.
It instills this profound, permanent sense of hypervigilance.
That is the exact mechanism at play here. His environment essentially programmed him to constantly scan rooms for threats, to never project vulnerability, and above all, to survive through total self-reliance.
Right, and that hypervigilant programming followed him through this really disorienting series of relocations. I mean, San Francisco, then Gainesville, Florida, before he eventually landed in Newton Upper Falls, which is a working-class suburb just outside of Boston.
And Boston in the 1980s was a crucible of its own. It was defined by these intense tribal loyalties, harsh winters, and a very specific kind of aggressive intellectual density.
But Boston is also where the trajectory completely shifts. Because at 14, he discovers martial arts.
Yeah, the turning point.
He starts with karate, then moves to taekwondo at 15. Yeah. And we often casually refer to martial arts as just like physical training or a sport.
Sure, yeah.
But looking at the source material, I see this functioning entirely differently for him. It looks like martial arts acted as a psychological scaffolding.
Oh, that's interesting. Break down how you see that scaffolding working in this specific context.
Well, think about his baseline. His childhood up to that point was defined by chaos, unpredictability, and an abusive authority figure.
Right.
Suddenly, Taekwondo offers him a framework where gravity applies. There are strict rules. It is a pure, undeniable meritocracy.
Yeah, there's no faking it.
Exactly. You don't get your black belt through charm or political connections or family wealth. You earn rank through the brutal, mechanical repetition of physical competence. It basically gave a traumatized kid control over his own reality.
And he completely masters it, too. By 19, he is a U.S. Open lightweight champion.
Right.
He becomes highly proficient, fast, and precise. But I think the most critical piece of that foundation wasn't the trophies.
What was it then?
It was the learned ability to endure physical and mental pain without quitting. I mean, he eventually recognized the neurological limitations of full contact fighting, the accumulated injuries, the brain damage from repeated strikes, and he retired from competitive martial arts.
Yeah, a smart move.
But the psychological wiring, that strict scaffolding you mentioned, that was permanent. And he immediately ported that exact mental architecture over to his next pursuit in 1988, which was the brutal Boston comedy scene.
The scene that was notoriously ruthless, by the way. You're dealing with aggressive, drunken hecklers, and deeply cynical local comics.
Oh, Boston crowds are legendary for that.
But because of his martial arts background, he didn't treat stand-up comedy as some, like, mystical, ethereal art form. He treated it as a blue-collar trade.
Yeah, just reps.
Exactly. You bomb on stage, you adjust the mechanics of the joke, you iterate, and you get back up. But I really think the most vital part of his psychological development happens a couple of years later, in 1990, when he moves back to Newark temporarily to live with his grandfather.
Oh, the commute.
Yes, the commute. He moves to Newark so he can commute into Manhattan and break into the New York comedy scene. I want you, the listener, to think about your own daily commute for a second.
It's grueling.
Right. Now, imagine starting it every single afternoon in gritty, working-class New Jersey, surrounded by people doing heavy manual labor. Then you take the train into the glamorous, neon-lit illusion of Manhattan comedy clubs.
Right.
And then at 2 a.m., you have to take the train all the way back to the reality of Newark. Doing that pendulum swing every single day would absolutely strip away any tolerance for elite pretense.
Yeah, Newark acts as an anchor in that scenario.
Yeah.
You literally cannot become untethered from reality or develop a massive Hollywood ego when you are forced to return to the baseline of working-class existence every single night.
Totally.
That unshakable blue-collar discipline did more than just help him survive the stand-up circuit. It forged the impenetrable armor he would need just a few years later.
So he has this impenetrable armor built in Boston and Newark. How does a guy with zero tolerance for pretense survive when he's suddenly dropped into the most artificial place on earth, which is 1990s Hollywood?
It's a massive culture clash.
Because in 1994, he moves to Los Angeles and actually lands a major network role playing Joe Gorelli, a conspiracy theorist electrician, on the NBC sitcom NewsRadio.
Right, and he survives it by treating it strictly as financial fuel. The sitcom provided stability, sure, but he never stopped treating stand-up as his primary trade.
Yeah, he kept touring.
Always. And then the cultural paradox happens. From 2001 to 2006, he becomes the host of Fear Factor. He is suddenly a massive household name.
Massive.
But millions of Americans know him exclusively as the guy making reality TV contestants eat live insects and face extreme phobias on primetime television.
I really have to push back hard on our cultural memory here, because mainstream society remembers him almost exclusively as the Fear Factor guy from that era.
Right, the guy cheering while people ate bugs.
But the irony is astounding. While middle America was watching him hand out gross-out physical challenges on NBC, his actual 10,000 hours of mastery, the real foundation of his future empire, were being logged somewhere entirely different. He was cage-side at the UFC.
Yeah, the 1997 hiring as a backstage interviewer and eventual color commentator for the Ultimate Fighting Championship is the actual linchpin of his entire broadcasting career.
It's huge.
We have to strip away the current context to understand this. The UFC in 1997 was not the multi-billion-dollar, globally sanitized sports brand we see today.
No, not at all.
It was violently niche. It was banned in multiple states. Politicians were actively campaigning against it, openly deriding it on the Senate floor as, quote, human cockfighting.
It was on the absolute fringes of society.
Yep.
Picture the sensory reality of a 1997 UFC event. It's chaotic, it's bloody, the rules are barely defined, and the production value is just raw.
And amidst that chaos, he fundamentally understood the underlying mechanics. He could look at two men tangled in a cage and instantly break down the technical nuances of a Brazilian jiu-jitsu submission, a Muay Thai clinch, or collegiate wrestling leverage.
Right.
Doing that effectively required an immense amount of technical knowledge, obviously, but more importantly, it had to be delivered with authentic, unscripted enthusiasm.
Which was so rare, though.
Completely. He actively rejected the corporate, polished, teleprompter-driven broadcasting style of the era. He wasn't talking down to the audience. He was talking as a to other fans for hours on end, completely live.
It's the ultimate broadcasting incubator.
Yeah.
You have to think on your feet, manage the pacing of a live event, and maintain high-level analytical energy without a script to fall back on.
Yeah, it's a tightrope walk.
He was quietly building an unprecedented endurance for unscripted conversation.
Oh.
And that unique combination of conversational agility and sheer stamina set the stage for a very quiet, almost accidental experiment on Christmas Eve that would eventually tear the global media landscape apart.
Picture the media landscape in the late 2000s. Everything is tightly controlled. Cable news dominates the narrative with these highly produced, combative, 7-minute television segments.
Everything was a soundbite.
Sound bites were everything. So as a total, albeit quiet, rebellion against that structure, On December 24, 2009, he just sets up a webcam in his house. Episode 1 of the Joe Rogan Experience goes live with his friend Brian Redban.
Just a total experiment.
There is no network approval, there are no commercial breaks, there are no time limits, and there is absolutely no plan.
They just hit record and let the tape roll.
Yeah.
I mean, in a world obsessed with brevity, he decides to do 2, 3, sometimes 4-hour runtimes.
Yeah.
And as we dig into the source material, it becomes clear that this structural revolution was built on 3 distinct pillars: martial arts, comedy, and psychedelics.
Right.
We've established the martial arts pillar. You know, giving him the sheer physical and mental endurance to sit in a chair, actively listen, and stay hyper-focused for 4 hours.
Yeah, stamina.
And we understand the comedy pillar, knowing how to riff, how to let dead air breathe without panicking, and how to manage the rhythm of a hostile or complex conversation.
Exactly.
But I need you to connect the dots on this third pillar for me. I buy the martial arts and comedy angles, but psychedelics...
Yeah, it sounds crazy at first.
It sounds like a massive stretch to say that taking DMT or psilocybin is the secret engine behind a media empire's journalistic disruption. Walk me through the actual business or broadcasting logic there.
Okay. It is actually the most essential component of his philosophical framework. When you read his descriptions of DMT experiences, breaking through the visual field, encountering autonomous entities, witnessing geometric patterns in alternate dimensions, the literal neurological reality of those experiences almost matters less than the philosophical outcome they produce.
Okay, how so?
Well, once your baseline acceptance of reality is fundamentally shattered by a molecule, it forces an epistemological crisis.
Wait, define epistemological crisis in this context for the listener really quick.
Yeah, so it essentially means your brain literally breaks down its own definition of what is true and what is false. Your entire framework for acquiring knowledge is destabilized.
Oh, I see.
If your own eyes and societal conditioning told you that alternate dimensions don't exist, right? And then a psychedelic substance violently proves to your consciousness that they do, you are left with a structural skepticism of everything you previously accepted as fact.
Okay, the logic dictates. If the government and legacy institutions were fundamentally wrong or actively lying about the true nature of these substances in human consciousness, what else are they lying about?
Exactly. Questioning official government narratives regarding the physics of 9/11 or the mechanics of the moon landing, or years later, the origins of COVID-19, it becomes a completely logical next step. His worldview demanded inquiry into the forbidden. He didn't just host mainstream, peer-reviewed experts. He hosted whistleblowers, fringe thinkers, and discredited scientists because his entirely altered perception of reality required him to hear them out.
He couldn't just accept a premise anymore.
Exactly. He could no longer accept a narrative simply because a legacy news network or a government agency declared it to be the definitive truth.
And this philosophical imperative to question absolutely everything is what ultimately builds an audience of hundreds of millions.
Yeah, people were craving that.
When you are the only major platform offering unedited, multi-hour conversations with the people the establishment has banished, the audience flocks to you. But inevitably, achieving that scale of influence puts him on a direct, high-speed collision course with the legacy media establishment.
Which brings us to the crucible of his career. By 2020, the Joe Rogan Experience is achieving an incomprehensible 190 million downloads per month.
190 million. That's just a wild number.
It's unprecedented scale, and it leads to the historic exclusive licensing deal with Spotify in May 2020, which was estimated at over $200 million. He moves his entire massive unedited catalog over to their corporate platform.
And then the firestorm hits. Early 2022. He interviews Dr. Robert Malone, a virologist who is heavily questioning the safety protocols of mRNA vaccines, and Dr. Peter McCullough, a cardiologist who is highly critical of mainstream vaccine mandates.
Right.
The reaction from legacy institutions, politicians, and competing media companies is instantaneous and incredibly aggressive.
Yeah, and to analyze the mechanics of this media attack impartially, without validating or dismissing the medical claims themselves, we saw traditional legacy institutions deploy classic cancellation tactics.
The usual playbook.
Exactly. Legacy artists, most notably Neil Young and Joni Mitchell, pulled their entire music catalogs from Spotify in protest. The public pressure on the corporation's board of directors was immense. The goal, mechanically speaking, was to force the distributor to deplatform the creator.
Think of legacy media power like an hourglass.
Okay, yeah.
The top of the hourglass is the vast amount of creators, and the bottom is the audience. The choke point is the tiny neck in the middle. The network executives, the advertisers, the board members.
The gatekeepers.
Right. Historically, if those people at the choke point didn't like what you were saying, they simply plugged the neck, and you were cut off from the public forever. They tried to squeeze that choke point at Spotify.
But the tactic failed entirely because his power was fundamentally decentralized. Spotify added content advisories to episodes discussing the virus, but they fundamentally refused to censor the conversations or remove his archive from the platform.
They couldn't afford to lose him.
Exactly. Legacy media could not squeeze the choke point because he owned the audience's trust, not a corporate mandate. The audience was actively choosing his unfiltered, messy, 3-hour conversations over the tightly sanitized narratives of legacy institutions.
And this standoff leads directly to the February 2024 renewal. $250 million, but this time he secures a non-exclusive deal.
Which changes everything.
It really does. He is allowed to distribute his podcast back on YouTube and other platforms while still getting paid by Spotify. To me, securing a non-exclusive deal of that magnitude after surviving a global cancellation effort is the ultimate act of defiance.
Yeah, it's a massive flex.
It proves definitively that the individual creator had become exponentially more powerful than the global distributor. He bypassed the hourglass entirely.
Securing absolute digital sovereignty was a historic victory. But to truly cement this legacy, he clearly felt he needed to pull that digital culture into the physical world.
Right, he needed a home base.
He needed to build a geographic sanctuary to protect the exact unvarnished stand-up culture that originally birthed him back in Boston.
And that geographic migration begins in 2020. He leaves Los Angeles, a city that had defined entertainment for a century, and moves to Austin, Texas.
Yeah, looking for a completely different vibe.
He is openly seeking a libertarian ethos, deliberately moving away from California's high taxes and strict pandemic regulations, which he viewed as increasingly authoritarian. And this single relocation by one man sparks a massive industry-wide comedy exodus.
It was crazy to watch happen in real time.
Giants of the industry, Dave Chappelle, Tom Segura, Tony Hinchcliffe, they all gravitate toward the gravity well he creates in Austin.
It becomes the new undeniable center of the comedy universe, and then in 2022, he executes a physical manifestation of his blueprint. He purchases the historic 1929 Ritz Theater building on 6th Street in Austin and completely transforms it into the Comedy Mothership.
It is less of a club and more of a fortress. He builds 2 distinct showrooms, fittingly named The Fat Man and The Little Boy, which is a nod to his fascination with history and destructive power.
Right, the atomic bombs.
He installs pristine acoustic soundproofing and perfect tiered sightlines. But the most important architectural feature of the mothership is the strict phone-free policy. When you walk in, you must lock your mobile devices in unopenable pouches.
And that policy is entirely by design. It is engineered to prevent recording, to prevent the malicious extraction of a 10-second joke for out-of-context digital destruction on social media.
A safe space for comedians.
Exactly. It is an environment where comedians can actually practice the blue-collar trade of working out dangerous material without the modern paralyzing fear of cancellation.
But alongside this physical monument in Austin, there is the digital accumulation. He has produced over 2,000 unedited multi-hour podcast episodes. And I want to introduce a concept here for you to consider.
Okay.
We shouldn't view the JRE archive simply as a highly successful commercial media product. We need to view it as a primary historical document.
Oh, that's a profound way to look at it.
Imagine historians a century from now, sitting in the 22nd century. They're trying to understand the exact anxieties, the shifting paradigms, the fears, and the bizarre curiosities of early 21st century Americans.
Yeah, they won't look at the news.
They aren't going to look at highly edited, sterile cable news broadcasts. They're going to use these thousands of hours of unedited conversational tape as an unprecedented sociological data set.
The sheer, unbroken accumulation of take is the legacy. He didn't set out to build an encyclopedic historical archive. He just stubbornly refused to stop talking.
Basically, yeah.
Summarizing his current state in 2026. He is 58 years old. He has an estimated net worth of over $200 million, and he answers to absolutely nobody. The Comedy Mothership isn't just a nightclub, and the podcast isn't just an audio show.
What are they then?
Together, they stand as an institutional bulwark against algorithmic control. I mean, he still trains martial arts daily, he still flies out to call UFC fights, he still takes psychedelics to shatter his reality, and he is still relentlessly questioning authority.
Which brings us directly back to you, listening to this deep dive right now. I want to challenge you to critically examine your own daily media diet.
It's important to do.
We live in a world that increasingly aggressively demands conformity. Algorithms are flawlessly designed to feed us exactly what we already believe, packaged in neat, easily digestible, emotionally validating clips. Ask yourself, how often do you truly engage with unedited, long-form, wildly conflicting viewpoints?
Yeah.
How often do you willingly sit through a 3-hour conversation that actively challenges your baseline understanding of reality?
It is the most vital question for the modern digital era.
Yeah.
Because his architectural blueprint has proven beyond any doubt that you do not need the approval of legacy gatekeepers to build an empire. You just need to maintain the sheer endurance to keep the conversation going when everyone else tells you to stop.
But looking at this massive archive and this fortress he's built, it leaves us with a profound, lingering question. How long can one man sustain a media empire built entirely on unfiltered conversation in a world that increasingly demands ideological conformity? Will the next generation of independent creators successfully follow this blueprint to build their own sanctuaries? Or will the centralizing forces of corporate media and algorithmic control finally figure out how to squeeze the choke point and eliminate platforms like his from existence? Thank you for listening to the Golden Gems podcast. We'll be back next time with another deep dive. Until then, keep exploring, keep listening, and keep celebrating the power of uncompromising voices.